the first question that I was asked to do with footwork. And I don't consider myself a master of footwork. I know fighters who can beat me with better footwork. But I feel like I understand the basics of it and have gotten good enough at it to share some good stuff. My footwork is partly shaped by my experience doing Kung Fu before I found the SCA. I found that most Eastern martial artists have similar ideas about footwork. Western boxers tend to have a little different take on things, but especially once you get a weapon involved, there's only so much variation that tends to really work for footwork. For the most part, you need to maintain the same basic ingredients, and you can put them together whatever way you want. You need to be balanced. If you are leaning, that's not great. It commits you to moving in a certain direction. It makes it more challenging to adapt to changing direction. And regardless of what your plan is for how you want to move, you have to be able to deal with what your opponent does as well. If they don't move the way that you want them to, you've got to be able to handle that. And if you're leaned in or leaned back, that's more challenging to do. You want to be flexible in order to be stable as well as to generate power. If you are lock-kneed, there's only so far you can move. If you bend your knees and imagine yourself sitting down just a little bit, you're going to be in a much more flexible place where you can move a lot farther, where you can rotate your hips to generate power, and even where if you need to lean, you can do so without losing your control, without losing your stability, your base, because you can shift and counterbalance much more readily. Try while you do that to keep your spine upright. So that's why we talk about it's kind of like sitting down. When you are moving, you want to stay steady for a bunch of reasons. New people especially tend to bounce a lot. And that's okay, but it's going to come with some serious costs. For one thing, if you bounce upward, your opponent knows you've got to come down. You are kind of stuck moving in that one direction for a while. It's a matter of fractions of a second, but fractions of a second win and lose fights. You want to be like the steady cam, not like the J.J. Abrams shaky handy cam in the movies. If you are bouncing all around, up and down, your opponent is going to track your movements much better. If you're steady, it doesn't set off the same alarms in the human brain and nervous system. If I move straight toward you, you don't see that and act on it nearly as quickly as if your reactions to those two things are really different, and the difference is important. The best way you can work on this is just level off and say, okay, I'm just gonna keep my head at the same height wherever I need to go, whatever I need to do. You can use crescent steps, you can do whatever exact version of this you want, but keep that goal in mind. Steady, even height, not lunging up or dipping down, unless it's for a very specific reason. If you say, okay, I'm going for this low angle and I'm going to do this thing, I have an idea of how it's going to work and why, okay, that might be worth it. But don't just bounce around in terms of how you move, or it's gonna cost you. And smoothing it out is gonna help. I've often seen shorter fighters try to stand as tall as they can to make up for the fact that they're short. There's no need for it. a fraction of an inch, sometimes an inch change in height, is rarely going to make a huge difference in a fight. It can. But it's going to make less of a difference than if it costs you, mobility. The loss of mobility is going to be greater. If you're standing up as tall as you can, you're not going to move well. Bend your knees a little bit, sit down a little bit. It's going to cost you a little bit in height, but it's going to give you much better movement and fluidity. And again, if your legs are stiff, you're standing up too tall, you only have so much hip movement to really work with. Bend your knees. Way more freedom. I don't want to actually swing all the way over here throwing a shot normally, but I want to have that freedom of movement, that flexibility. Also, if my knees are bent, I got one foot in front, leading the other, I can move in just about any direction pretty smoothly, whatever I need to do, without having to work to maintain balance, to counterbalance. And if I do actually need to lean, duck, something like that, I can adapt to that much better under those circumstances than if I'm starting from up here trying to be tall. I am tall, I'm 6'1", so I only have so much room to speak. Shorter fighters have kicked my butt before, and I'm sure it will happen again. But they're not the ones who are standing up tall on tippy toes. They're the ones who are comfortable at their height and keeping their mechanics and their balance strong, working for them. You can start with either foot leading the other, doesn't really matter. Some people like shield leg lead. I prefer leading with my sword side, like right-hander. Either one of those is fine. You kind of have to work with it to learn how to make the mechanics work from either location. And you really want to do that. If I'm fighting this way and my opponent changes on me, I've got to be able to change and fight from here and not be like, oh, well, I lost my stance. Guess the fight's over. That just won't fly. Either one will work. And just figure out what you need to do from either of those positions for the techniques you want to use. What usually doesn't work so well is squared up. From here, you can resist a decent amount of force from the side, but head on, back, it's not nearly as stable. If you're in really close with your opponent, you may end up squared up sometimes, but that should be a transitional step. That shouldn't be where you want to stay. It costs you power, and leading with one side instead of squared narrows your target profile. It means that the parts that your opponent can hit easily, closely, are fewer. Whichever side you're leading with, you're narrowing it up. In fencing, we'll often take this even farther, putting one heel behind the other heel in a very narrow stance. This is not ideal for generating striking power the way we do in SCA armored combat. So I don't recommend this at all for this type of fighting. If you're dealing with fencing that deals with thrusts and small cuts that don't move near as much and don't require as much power, it's fine. For what we do, it's good to imagine that there's a line from your center to your opponent's center, and your feet should ideally be on either side of that line, not on the line. Also, it's good to keep your feet pointed so that they are not across the line. An example of what I mean, let's say that this is my opponent. If I point my toe straight at my opponent, I have a window roughly formed by the angle of this foot, the angle of this foot, where I can easily deliver good power. The opponent's right on the edge of that. Yeah, man, it's hard to strike over here. So if he moves just a little bit, now he's exiting what Brian calls the power triangle. keep them in the middle of your power triangle instead. From here, if my opponent moves, I can still track and throw good power because they're still in that so-called power triangle where I can easily direct power at them. If I'm pointing my toe at the camera as an opponent, and again, if the opponent moves just a little bit this way, if I have to throw here, I'm really running out of range. I'm really limiting the amount of power that I can spend over there without throwing off my balance. And even if I change it to sword leg lead, again, pointing my toe directly at my hypothetical opponent, my opponent moves off to the side, now I'm in a more awkward position. I'm not as strong. If a force comes at me here through a charge or something like that, I'm not in as good a position to deal with it. So, leading with one foot or the other, and really practice both. Keeping the opponent in a triangle formed by the feet, not pointing your feet across the line. This is, again, limits your mobility, limits your ability to project power. I've seen people make it work, but they tend to have to work harder for it and have fewer options. And I like my options. And I think that when you're new and you're learning, it's really good to focus on techniques that give you more choices. If someday you want to specialize in something, great. But get really good and comfy with the basics first, is my take. Most of the time when you're moving, small steps, and plenty of them, is preferable to a few big bounds. I can cross the distance from here to there in one big step. But while I was doing that, I was completely committed to that move. I couldn't do anything else. And if I needed to change direction in the middle of that, it wasn't happening. It's also probably opening up my defense as I move. If instead, some smaller steps keep me steadier, they make it possible for me to change direction in the middle of it, to adapt, and to keep my defense in a ready to adapt to changing circumstances position. Very thankful I made the notes. Okay. And by the way, it's not to say that big steps aren't a good idea, just that they're not the best way to work for most fighters most of the time. I do use some big steps now and then in my fight, and I like them. They can work well, but you've got to learn the timing to do them without getting blasted for it. If you are in close range especially, knees bent, you can move a decent amount without moving your feet if you learn to, if you build some strength in your legs. So I can drop, but I can also shift. You can think of this in terms of kind of sitting down further. I can get a decent amount of movement out of that if I've got a good stable position. If my footwork isn't stable to begin with, moving around like that's going to throw me off balance, and it's going to get me in trouble. There are what we call passing steps in fencing, which is generally, here's the opponent, I'm going to step past them. I'm going to try to get past the opponent. I might step. You tend to use longer steps if you're trying to do that. If you're circling, you can make use of a lot of smaller steps that allow you to adapt and adjust to what your opponent is or isn't doing to give you opportunities. One of the fundamental things to look out for when it comes to footwork is not crossing the line, aka the center line. Imagine that you're, again, got that line from the center of your opponent to the center of you. Ideally, your feet don't cross that. They never can. But again, it's not a good, first choice. If I want to take a step that way. I'm leading with my left leg. I should step with my left leg first and then gather with my right. That'll keep me from crossing up. Whereas, if instead I decide I'm going to step with my right here, my legs are crossed up. If I get hit with a charge here, I'm in a bad way. I'm going to really have to work to recover my balance and stay up. And in that moment, I am completely focused on that task instead of on killing my opponent. Here, much less concerned about it. I'm sure I'm forgetting things, but that's what I can think of at the moment. Any further questions, let me know.